Hello everyone, welcome to the third part of my discussion of Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. In this part I am going to discuss in detail the concepts of fancy and imagination and the difference between primary imagination and secondary imagination and the concept of the willing suspension of disbelief that Coleridge has elaborated particularly in the chapter 13 and 14 which is prescribed for your syllabus. So I am going to start with the concept of fancy. Fancy, according to Coleridge, is a mechanical operation of mind which has fixities and definities. I quote from Coleridge, "Fancy, on the contrary, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definities. The fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space, while it is blended with and modified by that empirical phenomenon of the will which we express by the word choice. But equally with the ordinary memory, fancy must receive all its material ready-made from that of law of association." So fancy is a mechanical human activity of receiving. Coleridge kind of borrows this idea from the associationist philosophy of David Hartley and David Hume. And as far as the associationist philosophy is concerned, a human mind is constantly receiving images and ideas from the outside world. Fancy is just to receive those ideas in its entirety as it is present in nature in the exact form. So it gets received. You see a picture of a tree and then it gets registered in your mind. So it's just a vision of the tree as it is get registered. So the mind doesn't play an active part here. Rather, the mind kind of is passively receiving this particular power, which he calls fancy. He differentiates fancy with imagination. He says imagination is more of a sort of a fusive power, unlike fancy. Whereas fancy is the power of plainly receiving what is already there in nature. Imagination plays the role of mingling whatever you have already received in your mind and giving them new ideas and new shapes. So imagination and fancy are two things. Fancy is just a mechanical process of receiving those images and the ideas in its entirety. Every image comes with an idea. For example, whenever we utter a particular word, there is a sense of an idea attached with it. Whether it is a simple word like a pen, or a simple word like a tree, or the simple word like a laptop or a computer. The moment we utter this word actually signals a certain or indicates at a certain kind of sense that we have already derived in the course of our upbringing about that particular process. So fancy is to receive those ideas in its entirety. Imagination is the power of fusing those elements. For example, to combine an element of the computer with that of the human brain. When we say that kind of stuff, I'll give you an example to clarify this particular thing. Fancy is like you have seen a fish, and the memory and the idea of a fish is registered in your mind. You have seen the picture of a beautiful woman, and that idea is also registered in your mind. That is simply fancy. That fish remains fish, and the picture of the woman remains as the picture of the woman in your head. Imagination is the power to mingle both and create the figure of the mermaid, which was not there. So taking both the fish and the figure of the woman, which does not, at least apparently, have no connection, then joining together, the fusing together in those in the shape of a mermaid. That is what Coleridge identifies as imagination. He gives one example one distinction between a chemical compound and a mixed compound. Like fancy is like mixing elements, mixing 2 or 3 individual things together, but in such a way that in that particular mixture, that individual elements retain their individuality. retain their individuality. For example, you can, to give an example from science, you can mix hydrogen gas with oxygen gas, and then in a container, and you can sort of identify both the hydrogen and oxygen in the same container individually. But when you make them go through a particular scientific process, and those hydrogen and the oxygen actually combines into give you a molecules of water, then it becomes a sort of a act of imagination. Because in this new compound, that is H2O, water, hydrogen and oxygen does not retain its individual quality, but they kind of get fused to give birth to something new. So imagination is like a chemical compound, whereas fancy is like a mixture, where every individual item can be identified with their individual features, whereas in the act of imagination, every individual item loses its individual identity and get mixed to give birth to something new. So Coolidge differentiates between this fancy and imagination, idea of fancy and imagination, in this way. Now he also identifies imagination as two, as primary imagination and secondary imagination. Now I'm going to describe this concept of primary imagination and secondary imagination. Primary imagination, he believes, is common to all human beings. It enables us to perceive and make sense of the world. We get a picture, we see a picture, and then we attach it individually with a set of idea. For example, if someone likes sweet, and he had a tremendous liking for some other things as well, like for example a cricket match. So he can immediately associate the pleasure of watching a cricket match with the pleasure of eating a sweet. Those can be combined. This is simple common thing. So through ideas, through sensation, through feeling, we can communicate, we can combine these two things. This is what primary imagination is all about. Primary imagination is common to all human beings. Almost all of us does possess the sensibility of joining these two ideas together. Now, it is a creative function and thereby repeats that divine act of creation. This makes human beings different from the other animals, because the other animals sees nature as they are, whereas the human beings had the tremendous power to fuse already those elements that have been created in this world, probably by God or someone else. That those creative element has been recreated with a human intellect, with a human imagination. So it is a sort of a creative function that is possessed by almost every human being, however dull he is, and it is an act of recreation. If we believe in the concept that God is the first creator, it's the power of receiving impressions from the external world and joining it within his mind. Now, secondary imagination, which is different from primary imagination only in degree, is something possessed by the poets and the literary artists only. Here, it enables them not only to connect two similar ideas, but to connect completely discordant ideas, discordant elements, which are not, in a general sense, connected with each other. If you remember John Donne's poem, he compares the lovers with, a pair of compasses in one of his poems, and he compares, the lovers as flies. So these two completely discordant idea, they have been fused, this kind of merged into something, and this particular effect that those fusion has created would be sustained for a long time only by a man with this creative genius, which Coleridge has termed as the magical power. This is he called the secondary imagination. It is the creative impulse that enables poetry or all other kinds of creative activity. It is the power of creating impressions of the internal mind. I quote a small passage where Coleridge has described the concept of primary imagination and secondary imagination. The imagination then, I quote, The imagination then I consider either as primary or secondary. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and the prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. The secondary I consider as an echo of the former, coexisting with the conscious well, yet still as an identical with the primary in the kind of its agency. So how he differentiates between the primary imagination and secondary imagination in this particular passage, and differing only in degree, as I said. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate, or where the process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events struggle to idealize and to unify. So the function of the secondary imagination is to dissolve, diffuse, dissipate in order to recreate, from various collecting materials from various sources of life, to create something which is new, to create something which has a magical effect which might not have been present in this world. Remember my analogy of the concept of the mermaid and how we arrive at that. Now, by a poet who has this magical effect, who had that tremendous magic of creating that dome in the air, as he has beautifully said in the Kubla Khan, he can create the dome in the air with that magical potential that he had, with flashing eyes and floating hair that he has said. He can create a sensation of disbelief, which to the logical mind to be something can be identified as something supernatural, as not really something that we can logically or with reason establish, but something that we like to believe, we like to cherish, and something which has which appeals to our aesthetic self. So this secondary imagination, which Coleridge also identifies as esemplastic imagination, the power of fusion, creates this effect of a sense of a disbelief, which he terms as a willing suspension of disbelief. This disbelief that our logical mind may reject, but this is a sensation that we are willing to create in our mind, a sense of pure magic, which we may not establish logically, but we may like to believe. That's why he calls it willing suspension of disbelief. It's a willingness to kind of somewhat for some time at least, to forget the logical bend of mind and to believe in that real creative world. Coleridge has brilliantly done this, created this willing suspension of disbelief himself in his poems like the Kubla Khan and Christabel, like this. So this willing suspension of disbelief, Coleridge considers to be one of the main one of the main desires of poetry, and a poet can achieve that only with the help of his secondary imagination, which has that esemplastic power of fusing two discordant elements into one, which can make this reconciliation of this incompatible possible. I quote this particular phrase from Coleridge himself: reconcilement of the incompatibles, like the bright sunny dome in the caves of ice, as he has said. You can combine two completely opposite things. Sunlight and ice cannot coexist, but a poet can make them coexist in the through their poetic creation. They can create the dome or that dome of Kubla Khan in air themselves, that willing suspension of disbelief. So now I would move on to give my critical estimate is of Coleridge's poetic positions. Coleridge somewhat sets to answer those questions which remain unanswered in Wordsworth's doctrine of poetry, particularly the differing notion of nature versus art. He can brilliantly sum this up and logically establish this fact that even matter, which is identified by Wordsworth as something artificial, can be a natural part of the of poetry itself, and it's not something as supernumerary element. It can be can be made a part of the essential parts of poetry, which finally combines to give a sense of wholeness. So he can kind of solve in his way the problem of this dialectic between nature and art that Wordsworth has somewhat failed to answer. Second, Coleridge's treatment or Coleridge's observations are often identified as impressionistic observations on poetry, but it does leave certain impressions on some of the very important questions that other romantic critics have failed to answer. So that's why Coleridge is rated that much as a romantic critic. Coleridge was a philosopher who believed that that empirical investigation without a prior idea is helpless, and discoveries can be made only by a prepared mind. So he always had a sort of already had that idea that a system of belief, a particular system has to be placed in his mind when you are trying to explore this particular idea, and that is how he is probably making a critique of Wordsworth also here, that Wordsworth does not really kind of being able to find a system of principles which can kind of substantiate his vision of poetry, which Coleridge has done. His his concept of the taken from the transcendental philosophies of Kant and that of the associationist philosophy, he has been able to identify the basic tenets of poetry and to with a particular system. So his observations are backed with a sort of empirical validation, empirical data, and he could come out with his own theoretical position before finally postulating his views on literary criticism and poetic composition. Coleridge roots his theory in the constitution and activity of the creative mind, as I have already said, and like all romantic critics, Coleridge has also prioritized the role of the creative mind in the construction of poetry, and he time and again said that mind is the source and the taste of art, and it is in the mind that poetry germinates and not in the outer world, and that is how Coleridge demarcates himself from the neoclassicals as well. Then, unlike the neoclassicals, he believed that the source of every poetry is that individual creative mind. This creative mind is the source of that, and the creative mind can kind of take recourse to anything, but the ultimate pleasure, ultimate desire of every poetic composition is to give pleasure in general. Giving truth can also be a kind of providing a channel, providing a route towards identification of the truth can also be an object, but the primary purpose would be the purpose of providing delight, providing a sort of pleasure. That should be the purpose of poetry that he identifies, and that is why the individual mind tends to create in order to give pleasure, because poetic composition is a pleasurable process. It gives the creator the pleasure, and the creator is trying to transmit the sense of pleasure to the reader through this composition. So Coleridge's disagreement of Wordsworth therefore is fundamental, and he sort of tried to provide a cushion to those observations of Wordsworth relating to the nature of poetic composition, and in my estimate he has been successful to a certain to a large extent in this effort. Now with this I would finish my discussion on this topic. As all of you can understand, this is a very dense topic, and I expect all of you to sort of come out with various questions on the things that have been discussed. I would love to answer them in detail. So post your questions in this in the group, and I will try to answer them, and then I will move on to the next topic that I have declared that I will take after this. Thank you. Hello everyone. Welcome to the third part of my discussion of Coleridge's biography.